In January 2012, 33-year-old Iraima Chavez was found dead inside her apartment in Arlington, Texas. She had been stabbed more than 100 times, and for over a decade, police made 0 arrests. That changed in 2024. The FBI used genetic genealogy to trace a single 12-year-old drop of blood from the crime scene directly to a woman named Myra Velasquez. She was immediately charged with capital murder. This is the highest tier of felony, a charge carrying severe penalties, where defendants are held without bail. Yet, despite a gruesome crime scene and a direct DNA match, Velasquez walked out of the Tarrant County Jail. Her bond was set at $450,000, allowing her release with a GPS monitor. A bond set at this level for a capital charge suggests the court's assessment found specific points of friction within the government's evidence. To understand how this happens, you have to look at how a judge calculates bail. Bail functions strictly as a pretrial risk assessment, rather than a premature judgment of guilt. The court evaluates several baseline factors. They assess whether the defendant poses a flight risk, and whether they present an ongoing threat to the community. This diagram illustrates the third, highly variable factor, the court's evaluation of the strength of the government's case. A gap of 14 years creates immediate legal friction. That passage of time actively degrades the prosecution's evidence before a trial begins. To understand why Velasquez was granted bond, we have to deconstruct the specific categories of evidence presented by the state. A bail hearing in a cold case acts as an early stress test. It previews exactly how the defense intends to dismantle the prosecution's narrative in front of a jury. The prosecution's strongest asset is physical. Detectives found a fresh drop of blood at the crime scene in 2012 that matches the defendant's DNA. For that blood to hold up in court, the prosecution must satisfy the legal requirement of chain of custody. They have to prove a continuous, unbroken, and pristine timeline of possession for that physical sample. This timeline charts the evidence life cycle. It begins in 2012 with the initial blood drop collection. 4 years later, the sample transferred to Parabon Nanolabs to build a physical suspect profile. By 2024, the FBI took possession of the sample for genetic genealogy, eventually matching it to DNA pulled from a fork Velasquez discarded at a restaurant. Facing this, a defense attorney will rarely attack the complex mathematics of genetic genealogy. Instead, they attack the handling. They target those red gaps on the timeline. They will demand to know exactly how many hands touched the sample over 14 years. Was it consistently stored in a temperature-controlled cooler? Did its structural integrity degrade during transit? This introduces a severe vulnerability inherent to cold cases, known as witness decay. The original technicians from 2012 must physically take the stand to authenticate how the sample was collected. If any individual in that chain is now deceased or unavailable, the evidence risks becoming legally inadmissible. As the timeline stretches across a decade, the prosecution's ability to verify the evidence degrades. An objective match turns into a legally vulnerable artifact. Even if the chain of custody holds, the defense will pivot to attacking the physical placement of the DNA within the crime scene. This map shows the layout of the victim's apartment. The drop of blood in question was found resting on a television stand in the bedroom. Crucially, you have to look at where the blood was absent. It was not found on a murder weapon, nor was it found underneath the victim's fingernails, which would strongly indicate a physical struggle. This aligns with a key piece of background information confirmed by law enforcement. The victim and the suspect were close friends prior to the murder. The defense weaponizes this friendship because it provides a highly plausible, innocent explanation for why Velasquez's DNA was inside the apartment. This comes down to the concept of probative value. This is the legal standard measuring the ability of a piece of evidence to actually prove a specific proposition at issue in the case. By establishing their friendship, the defense effectively severs the link between the blood drop and the violent act itself. The DNA now serves as proof of prior presence, moving it further away from proof of the murder itself. The state's burden shifts from identifying the owner of the blood to proving exactly when it was deposited on that television stand. The prosecution's final major piece of evidence is surveillance footage from the night of the 2012 murder, showing a shadowy figure in sweatpants approaching the victim's door. The state claims this figure is Myra Velasquez, arriving to commit the crime. The defense counter-strategy relies on utilizing demonstrative evidence at trial. They can physically have the defendant walk around the courtroom, allowing the jury to directly compare her actual height, weight, and gait to the footage. The defense asserts that the figure in the video appears to possess a male physical frame. They support this with forensic rationale. A crime scene with over 100 stab wounds indicates an intensely physical and passionate attack. By introducing a male suspect, the defense can invoke the higher statistical probability of domestic violence, drawing a contrast to a female-on-female crime of this magnitude. This graphic illustrates a massive technical blind spot in the prosecution's timeline. Just 10 minutes after the figure entered the apartment, the surveillance system was manually cut. The defense draws a logical deduction from this data. Whoever knew how to manually disable that specific camera system is highly likely to be the actual killer. Proving that Velasquez possessed the specific technical knowledge to disable that system back in 2012 adds yet another evidentiary hurdle for the state. By combining these physical discrepancies with the 10-minute camera blackout, the defense successfully takes a primary piece of prosecution evidence and uses it to manufacture reasonable doubt. This brings us back to the initial calculation. Why did a judge grant a $450,000 bond in a capital murder case? You have to look at the cumulative effect of these three evidentiary friction points: the 14-year gaps in the chain of custody, the circumstantial placement of the DNA, and the ambiguous surveillance footage. As the court factors in these points of friction, the strength of the government's case drastically shrinks. The resulting bond amount, paired with continuous GPS monitoring, was a carefully calculated split decision by the presiding judge. The genetic genealogy breakthrough by the FBI was a monumental investigative step. But an investigative success does not automatically yield a legally bulletproof prosecution. In a courtroom, objective science never speaks for itself. It only survives if it can withstand the grueling contextual gauntlet of the adversarial process. In January 2012, 33-year-old Iraima Chavez was found dead inside her apartment in Arlington, Texas. The crime scene was remarkably violent. The medical examiner later determined she had been stabbed more than 100 times. Detectives found no signs of forced entry. The only lead they had to go on was surveillance footage from outside her door. It shows a shadowy figure in sweatpants walking up the stairs, waiting for a minute, and then walking into the apartment. The next day, Chavez was found dead, and her television was missing. Looking closely at this microscope slide, you can see exactly what investigators found left behind on the victim's bedroom TV stand: a single droplet of fresh blood. Testing confirmed that it did not belong to the victim. That single drop of blood provided the exact physical blueprint of the killer. Instead of chasing a mystery with no leads, the investigation became a waiting game, pausing until forensic science could analyze the information locked inside that sample. The crime lab extracted a genetic profile from the blood, identifying the suspect as a Hispanic female. At the time, the next step was standard procedure. Detectives uploaded the profile to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. This database acts as a national catalog of genetic profiles collected from individuals who have previously moved through the criminal justice system. But CODIS has a strict limitation. It only generates a match if the person you are looking for has a prior criminal record and is already in the system. When Arlington police ran the blood drop, they got 0 hits. Because the killer had managed to avoid a prior arrest, the investigation hit a wall. A murderer was able to walk free because the technology of 2012 could not identify a first-time offender. 4 years passed with no arrests. In 2016, the Arlington police tried a new approach. They sent a sample of the blood to Parabon Nanolabs to perform a technique known as DNA phenotyping. Instead of checking a genetic string against a list of known criminals, phenotyping reads the genetic markers inside the blood to predict a person's physical appearance. It identifies the specific base pairs that determine skin tone, hair color, and eye shape. The lab used those biological instructions to create a composite image of what the suspect likely looked like: a Hispanic woman in her 20s. Detectives released this face to the public, but a face is not a name. Without a direct identity to confirm, the lead completely fizzled out, and the case went cold once again. The break occurred in 2024. As we see the seal on the FBI headquarters here, federal agents stepped in to apply a brand new investigative tool to that 12-year-old blood sample: Genetic Genealogy. Looking at these consumer ancestry DNA kits, you can see how investigators shifted away from criminal databases. They tapped into the publicly available genetic data provided by millions of citizens curious about their family heritage. By uploading the crime scene DNA into these public networks, investigators look for partial matches to distant cousins. They then build a family tree backward to a common ancestor and follow the branches back down to zero in on a single living suspect. The search led to Myra Velasquez. Since 2012, she had become a successful Dallas area real estate agent, married, and had a son. Her social media showed she traveled to Jamaica, South America, and Europe, as seen in this view of the Eiffel Tower. To confirm the link, police tailed Velasquez to a restaurant and retrieved a fork she threw in the trash. The DNA on that fork tested positive as a match to the drop of blood left at the crime scene 12 years earlier. Millions of individual family searches inadvertently created the database that identified a suspect who had remained in plain sight for over a decade. An arrest is the first step toward a trial, but not necessarily a conviction. Shortly after Velasquez was booked into the Tarrant County Jail complex, seen here, a judge set her bond at $450,000. She posted the money and was released with a GPS monitor. Genetic genealogy provides police with an investigative lead, but it is vulnerable when brought into a courtroom. A defense attorney's job is to challenge that science in front of a jury. The defense is expected to attack the chain of custody. They will question how that single drop of blood was handled over a 14-year period. Any gap in documentation or storage reliability could lead a jury to question the integrity of the sample. Even if the DNA matches Velasquez, her defense can argue circumstantial placement. Because she was a close friend of Chave's, her lawyers will claim her DNA could have been left in the apartment during a prior peaceful visit. Her legal team is also challenging the original video evidence. They point out that a successful real estate agent has no motive to steal a television and argue that the shadowy figure in the footage appears to be a man. When prosecutors build a case on decades-old scientific evidence, they give the defense several procedural and logical paths to introduce reasonable doubt to a jury. The rapid development of forensic technology has turned genetic genealogy into a primary tool for solving the most difficult cold cases. In this Texas courtroom, the burden falls on the prosecution. Explaining the science is insufficient. They must prove its execution was flawless beyond a reasonable doubt. Identifying a suspect through an ancestry site is how the police make an arrest. But the ultimate test of genetic genealogy is not whether it holds up in a laboratory. It is whether it survives the courtroom.